Hi, I'm Pearl. Anyway, I thought this particular video, I've been saying a certain thing and seeing a certain thing for quite a while now on, particularly on things like LinkedIn. And I knew what I was seeing, but I suddenly realized that a lot of people don't understand this concept, the concept of denial. And so I felt it incumbent upon me to do a video about denial and about complicated grief. So in amongst all my adventures and escapes and all this kind of thing, one of the things that's happened is I've become an expert on grief. And in a way, it's kind of not really by choice, it's by necessity. And quite a while ago, when I was doing some volunteer work, because I'm like, ding, little halo here, I trained as a bereavement counsellor. But I had already experienced, like grief and loss that was very informative as we were going through this training on bereavement and grief. And I just, if you don't know the sort of the understanding of the grief process, this has been really created. The landmark work was done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who identified 5 stages of grief, which were denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And that's one of the things we went through and talked through in bereavement counselling. But we also talked through a lot of the things that people don't really understand and know about in terms of grief, which are things like, weird pains and chills or heat in the body, and your kind of mind going on holiday very often, where you sort of stand there, look at something, and you don't really know what you're doing. You sort of lose lose where you are. So I think we could quite safely say that even in a very simple grief process, there's a lot going on in the mind, body, and spirit. Now, I'm not an expert as such on complicated grief, because I believe this is actually a psychological term. And I first came across this in the back of a Brené Brown book. And again, Brené Brown's done some amazing work, which I'm going to reference in this, so please go and check out her work. But I was reading through a book of hers, and I think it was Rising Strong. And it was talking about a lot of situations and things that I was trying to deal with at the time. It was very good. I got to the end and it said, this book is not for people who are struggling with complicated grief. Because she talked about grief and grieving. And I thought, well, number one, that should have been at the beginning of the book. Sorry, Brené, but it should have been. And number two is like, yes, that's what I've got, And it's, the reason I want to do this is because I think that right now we are going through a very extraordinary time, a very challenging time globally. Obviously with the coronavirus outbreak and crisis, and also with this new awareness of racism, and I guess a kind of feeling that people really want to kind of get to it and sort this out. And there seem to be big changes happening where people are reaching down deep and trying to correct our trajectory in this world, in the UK and the US, and in other parts of the world as well. And both of these things are creating enormous psychological crisis for people, and a lot of grief in terms of the actual technical grief, as opposed to, as we might say in England, giving us a lot of grief, And that's because part of it is about loss. Part of it's about loss. Or if I say loss, you can probably kind of identify, grief, loss, But what a lot of people ignore or don't know or forget about is that grief also happens with positive change. Any kind of change can cause a grief or grieving process, because a lot of it is about letting go. Even the big positives in our lives often entail letting go of things. Okay. And I want to talk about this concept of denial, but actually let me just explain a little bit about complicated grief. And complicated grief happens in a number of situations. It can happen whenever we experience a grief that we find complicated to deal with, I guess. And I'm sure that there are technical ways of describing it. For me, and for a lot of people, what happens with complicated grief is, and with trauma, is that very often people will experience one trauma, and then they will go into what you might call a natural process of grieving. So you can imagine that person is quite vulnerable at that time, and it's a loss, and they're trying to deal with something that's huge that's happened in their life. And where a lot of problems happen are if somebody experiences another loss, another major change at the same time. So perhaps another bereavement or a job loss or something like that. And when that happens, it becomes very difficult for a person to go through like a normal healing process of grieving. Because grieving, don't get me wrong, is a healing process. It's a process of going from denial of, oh my gosh, I can't believe this has happened, I can't believe somebody's died, to a period of acceptance, when you get to a point where you say, I know, and I accept this loss, and you come to a place of peace. And when you throw two big losses at somebody, it can be extremely, extremely hard for somebody to cope. There are other reasons why grief can be extremely complicated. And in my life, one of those was I had a very, very complicated relationship with a family member who passed away very suddenly. And I had absolutely no capacity, absolutely no understanding of how to grieve for that person. And very often when we have something so huge that we don't feel we can deal with, it can create all kinds of difficult behaviour. And to understand that, let me talk a little bit more about denial. What's really important, and one of the big reasons I want to do this video, and I'm sorry it's a little bit stilted, but obviously this is quite a difficult subject for me to talk about. Denial is a very natural state. Like grief is a very natural process. And we have a difficulty, particularly I think in the West, in dealing with our grief, because we've started to feel very safe, and we can see that right now, and that the difficulties that we experience, say in England, when things change and we experience, having shortages of food or not being able to do the things that we want to do, we've become used to a certain set of freedoms and having certain things that we believe in and that we believe will be available to us. And so one of the things that happens with that is that we find it much more difficult to deal with loss and uncertainty. We want things to be certain, we want things to be safe, we want things to be insurable. We want to believe that nothing bad is ever going to happen to us. And that's just not life. Life happens, and we know that. But something has happened in our culture, and probably in the last, say, 100 years, probably since the last time we've had a terrible pandemic like this. And that is that we've created a kind of a mindset, a kind of psychology of having so much that we feel like we're safe in terms of our insurance, in terms of our possessions. And we have a culture of get. And what we've lost is the ability to let go. And we can see the impact of somebody like Marie Kondo, who's come along with her Japanese art of letting go and tidying up. And it is very much about letting go. And if we have to keep letting go of things, or if we choose to let go of things, it becomes very clear what's important, and it becomes very clear what we're hiding. And as she says, when you've got people with a lot of cluttered houses, what we're doing is actually hiding stuff within that house. And I found when I started to do her method of clearing out, I found a lot of things related to this particular family member who I hadn't really ever started grieving for. And it was like I'd hidden that somewhere in my house, so I didn't have to deal with it. And I think that's one of the things that's making this time so difficult for us. So I've got a little ant on my arm for some reason. Is that one of the things that's made it very difficult for us is that it's stripped away a lot of our comforts. It's stripped away a lot of our coping mechanisms. Sorry. Did you like that? Action. So we're in a position of feeling more vulnerable and stripped away. It means that a lot of us are having to deal with things that we didn't want to deal with, a lot of things that we were kind of hiding from. And the grief process is perfectly natural. And one of the things I've learned in terms of learning to grieve is to learn the difference between grieving and wallowing. And it's very easy to do. And I think, I was just thinking about this before, it's a lot like if you've had an eating disorder, we have to learn to eat again. So to learn to eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. Whatever kind of eating disorder you may have had, it's about learning to trust your body and eat healthily. And it can feel very scary because if you've suffered from an eating disorder where you didn't eat, it may have been through a fear of thinking, if I start eating, I'm never going to stop. And that same kind of fear can apply if you've had an eating disorder of eating too much food. So the thing about grieving is once we step into grieving, it can feel very scary even. Because I don't know if you ever got that feeling, if you feel, if I start crying, I'm never going to be able to stop. If I start grieving, I'm never going to be able to stop. And it's not true. That's not true. Because if we can get back in tune with ourselves, we can feel very clearly, like feeling when your tummy is full. We get that feeling of, I'm done crying. And now I can choose to go and do something enjoyable. I can go and do something else, And the thing about denial, so denial is a psychological state. And it's a perfectly natural state because often when we lose someone, it's a huge shock, and we need time to process that. We need time to get through that. And they often say when somebody dies, it can take you about a year and a day to actually realise that they're gone. So if somebody said to you could say to 100 people, you could go to a funeral, you could do all those sort of natural grieving things, or even say you lost your job. You could tell 100 people somebody died. You can tell 100 people I've lost my job. But you still wake up in the morning and you say, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe this is real. And I think a lot of us have gone through that with coronavirus, waking up in the morning and saying, I can't believe this. I can't believe we're here. I can't believe what's going on. And one of the things that happens with denial is that there are times when we literally cannot see things. We literally cannot understand or believe in something. And this is what I see, what we've seen from people around the world in relation to, our virus crisis and also with racism. And I was reading something, a post and some threads last week, and a guy was on there, and after a few posts I realised this guy has a really, really good heart. He has a really, really good heart, and he does not want to believe in institutional racism. He wants to believe it's finished. He wants to believe it's done. And I just thought, this guy is so nice and he's such a good heart. And he's tried so hard. You can see he's actually, but he doesn't want to believe that, and he cannot perceive it. He cannot see this. Not because he doesn't want to, but because he's incapable. And it's not like a judgment or anything negative. It's literally about somebody not being able to psychologically cope with a concept. Does that make sense? So I think one of the things that I'm saying right now is we do need to have more compassion if we're looking at somebody and we think they just cannot cope with the concept. And it's not about... it's difficult sometimes, because sometimes I also find people really angry about stuff and they're really, arguing it, and you sort of think it might be worth having the argument because this person's going through a process where they're, they are yelling at the walls, they are banging their head against the wall. And the same thing as if somebody's lost their job. Get really angry. It's like, you can't fire me, you can't fire me, you can't do this. And you're like, yeah, it's happening. This is happening whether you like it or not. And so there's a sort of anger and denial aspect to that. So I hope you can see a little bit about what I'm talking about. These things can be very, very messy. Grief is messy. And it comes in stages, it comes in waves. It can be more powerful than I think. I've discovered in the last few years it's more powerful than I ever thought. More deep-seated, more deep-rooted. Especially if it's been hanging around for a while. And like I say, in a normal grief process, not that probably there aren't anybody who has a normal grief process. It's like that's a concept too. It's about a year and a day, and you might do certain rituals to help you with grieving and the loss of, say, a loved one, like a funeral, like being able to get together and celebrate somebody's life, like maybe being able to clear out their clothes or plant flowers at their grave. All kinds of things that we might do to help heal. And when we don't have those rituals, it can be extremely hard to move forward and get out of denial. And another really big thing, and this is really kind of important, and this is how we can really help ourselves with denial, is, and I'm really grateful to Brené Brown for the work that she's done on this. Denial is something that we can help or we can hinder, If we make a choice, and this is where a lot of my work comes in, my work in actual Pearl Escapes, which is about helping people to feel alive, helping people to become successful, to deal with their fear of success. A beautiful spiritual concept that I've used a lot, I didn't make this up, is the concept of seek your bliss. So every day, follow your heart and find the thing that makes you joyful, that you enjoy. And when that happens, we come alive, we feel truly ourselves. And Brené Brown studied and wrote a really beautiful thing about our addictions, because our addictions allow us to numb emotion. And she said this thing, and it's very beautiful. She said, we cannot selectively numb emotion. So when we seek to stay in denial, say I can't cope with this, I can't cope with this, and I choose to drink or I choose to take drugs, I numb my emotions, I numb my joy, and I numb my pain. But what happens when I step into feeling alive and joyful, I awaken also my negative emotions. Yeah. So feeling truly alive is about experiencing all our emotions, our negative, our positive, our sadness, our joy. Today I visited family members and I felt so sad when I left. I felt so sad. And some people will not go and visit somebody, or will feel hesitant about visiting somebody or even phoning somebody, because they know that when they say goodbye it's going to make them sad. you know? And we often resist really great experiences because we don't want them. It's like we don't want to go to a party because we know we're going to be sad to leave it. So we just don't do it. We just don't do the joyful thing. Which is very, you know, we lose a lot when we behave that way. And so we step into feeling alive and we awaken to our grief. We awaken to anything negative as well as anything positive. It's like Marie Kondo's cleaning out the cupboards, cleaning out the closets. When we do that, we find our most joyful things and it's really loads of old shit that we should have got rid of years ago. And that's what grief really is like. We're clearing out and finding the things that make us joyful, the gifts that we've stuck in the bottom of the wardrobe or the bottom of the drawer because we've put it somewhere safe for later, you know? And so another experience I had of complicated grief, as I had another family member who had an illness which caused them to be very, very ill. And the reason I was thinking about this and I wanted to talk about this was because this is another reason, I think, for really complicated grief. And sometimes we're in a situation, I think this is very much like what we're experiencing now with coronavirus, and even with our huge shifts in terms of racism and trying to deal with that systemic racism and changing many things in our society. We don't know where we're going to end up. We don't know what our new normal is going to be like. So it's very difficult for us to grieve and adapt and adjust because we don't know where we're going to end up. Say, for example, you're self-employed like me and you had a business and you were doing something. You don't know if that business is going to come back at the end of the coronavirus crisis. We don't know how long it's going to last. If you're living with somebody, maybe your husband or wife, maybe things are difficult for you now, you don't know if your marriage is going to survive this crisis. You don't know where this is going to end up. And one of the things that happens in this kind of situation, say for example with this illness that my family member had, there's so much hope. There's so much hope that you will get back to exactly where you were. And it's really complicated. It's really complicated. And I think it's also bound up in the other aspects of grieving, like bargaining and anger and depression as well. But most of all, I think the thing is we become scared to adjust to where we are right now. Because it means letting go of the past. It means letting go of the old. And it's really difficult because, you know, I say it's complicated. Grief is complicated, and complicated grief is even more complicated. And denial is a very strange psychological state. So I guess, you know, I hope in this video what I've explained and reached out is just to say it's kind of normal to be a mess. And grief can happen for all kinds of reasons. And so I'm just going to make up a story now because I don't want to talk too much about my own personal story. But this is kind of similar to that. And so imagine you had the most beautiful love affair, the most beautiful relationship with somebody. And you love them so, so much. And it was the most perfect and beautiful and wonderful thing. And you got married and everything was perfect and you have all the photos on the wall. Say even that you have You know, it feels like your whole world revolves around this person, and you feel like you've got all the pictures on the wall about how amazing you are. And then slowly things start to go wrong. And I think, you know, every relationship has its ups and downs. And so you might go through a bad patch, and then things get better. And you think, wow, what was I worried about? No, this is great. And then you go through another bad patch, and it's slightly worse and it's slightly longer. And you think, is this really that bad, or is this, you know? So there's all these kind of questions, and as you can see, you know, when we start to lose something and things start to go wrong, sometimes that kind of like one day at a time thing, and is this getting worse? Is this getting better? I don't know. What's going to happen? Is the person who I love and who I fell in love with going to come back, or who is this other person? Who is this other person that I'm living with? What's going on? And sometimes we put away the pieces of ourselves. So maybe, you know, when we were with this person at the beginning, we were so in love, and we were, you know, carefree, and, you know, this kind of person. And then as you go through and you go through these bad patches, you have to start taking care of the other person. You have to start being the one that's really thinking things through. You have to start being the one that looks after them. And as you go on, you let go of pieces of yourself. And part of it is you don't really want to admit that this person has changed so much. And this is what often happens in marriages and in relationships. And there's a certain point when there's a grieving process, and there's also a level of denial of, I can't believe that this person who I fell in love with at the beginning and who was so amazing is gone forever. Where's that person gone? And so you can see that's kind of probably got more of a correlation with what we're going on with, you know, coronavirus, because we don't know where we're going to end up. Is this a bad patch? Is it everything going to come better? And for people who are maybe struggling in terms of racism, who see positives, who see adjustments, who see, you know, positives coming through, is this going to last? You know, are politicians going to keep paying attention? Our business is going to keep paying attention. Our corporation's going to keep trying to put things right. Or is something else going to come along and people are going to forget about this? And we hope, I hope, that this is the start of I use the word trend, but to create a universal equality, to create equality throughout. I hope so. But can those people who are actually working towards positive change also let go of the fear that the negatives will happen, that this will go back to square one? So yeah, there's a lot going on, and I hope this makes sense. But the important thing to remember is to have compassion with ourselves and other people if we are struggling and things don't make sense. Because in denial, you know, I remember very clearly at the beginning of coronavirus, when we were going through the first few days of lockdown, I remember waking up thinking, this can't be right, this can't be real, we can't be doing this. I've said about so many things in this time. No, I can't believe this. This can't be happening, this can't be happening. We can't do this, I can't do that. But slowly, we've come through months of it. And sadly, so many people have lost their lives. And that's really hard to even imagine, even to believe that we have suffered so much loss of life in the world. And I think that, you know, we're probably still all in shock about things that are still going on around the world. And we just hope that things will get easier and things will get better. But one of the things that's important is we have to face what's going on, and we have to find a way to work through our grief process and accept the changes in our lives. Because otherwise we're in limbo, otherwise we're not dealing with a new reality and a new normal. And I can tell you, and this is the truth for me, that I've spent most of my life in denial. I spent most of my life in denial because of complicated grief. And when I finally did wake up and I finally did start to be myself again after all those years, it was not easy. It was extremely painful. And I will tell you this from first hand, the longer we wait to come out of denial, the longer we wait to deal with our emotional baggage, the harder it is. It stagnates and it represses us, it holds us back, and it stops us from living our lives, And it is the fear of coming out of denial, it's the fear of I can't cope with this that stops us. A natural denial process is there because we are not yet ready to deal with certain things. When we start to numb and when we start to repress our emotions and our feelings, we extend the denial process and we make it more difficult. We make it much, much more difficult to deal with and to get through our grief. And at the end of that grief is just a beautiful acceptance. And for most people, again, to try and come back to some kind of analogy that hopefully makes sense, if somebody goes through a relationship that, like I said before, starts beautifully, goes downhill, I think we've always met people who have struggled with that so much, may have even got divorced, may even have moved on, and yet they still can't seem to let go of the past. And they can't let go of what happened. It's like, I can't believe that he left me for someone else. I can't believe, that he did this or she did that. I can't believe this. I can't believe the other. And we can see very clearly somebody is holding on to the past. And they're not living their lives. They're not getting on with now. Not getting on with what could be in this present moment, what could be all the joy, all the beauty, all the amazing things that you could reach out and pick off the tree of life and get on with it. And that's what I do. That's what I want to do, is help more and more people to live their lives, to feel alive, to get on with it, and to wake up and say, wow, guess what? I've got the rest of my life. None of us know how long it's going to be, but I have the rest of my life to do everything and anything that I can imagine, that I can dream. Wow, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And it's not easy sometimes. Sometimes when we go and do these amazing things, these beautiful things, so many times for me it was travelling, moving forward and travelling, and without, my family member, because they couldn't travel with me. And it wasn't until I was doing that I realised how much it hurt to be doing it alone. And I'm just going to end with this. My best example for this comes from Top Gun. And spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. When Maverick, who's the key character, he has an accident and his co-pilot, his Goose, dies in the plane crash. And he comes back and Goose's wife, says to him, she says, he would have hated to fly without you. He would have hated it, but he'd have done it. And, sometimes it feels like that, like you feel like your co-pilot is dead. And how can I go on? How can I do this thing that I loved and I enjoyed on my own? How can I, if you ever had a partner or somebody that you had something, a favourite restaurant or something, a meal you enjoyed, and you think, how can I ever enjoy this meal again without them? And then you do it. You do it. And it might feel really sad for a while. And it might feel really painful for a while. But then one day you just look up and you just think, you know what? I'm doing this. It's amazing. And they're still with me. They never left. You know, this person is still with me. And they're rooting for me. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about grief and grieving, is to accept finally that somebody, you know, they may be gone, but they're never gone. They're never gone. I hope that helps.